What does remembrance mean to you? I wonder what goes wandering in the whirlwind through your mind when it's this time of the year too. What is it that you're remembering? A friend or a brother, a father or mother? Perhaps it's your sister or wife or husband, or, God forbid, it's a child you're remembering. I'm not so arrogant to assume that I can put words into your mouths and say, I know what you're feeling, or I know where you've been, but I can tell you what I remember, and you compare the scene. Well, I remember two boys and one looking up to the other. I remember two stories, but bloodline connected these brothers. I remember bullies and you showing up to stop them. I remember black eyes, the tough lessons, and you giving them. I remember goodbyes and promises that you were always coming back. I remember phone calls, arguments, and our petty screaming match. I remember you sat in the audience for my first ever show. You caught me off guard because I never thought that you would go. I remember Dragon Ball Z in our living room and threats to never tell. Not a word to anyone. You would drag me down to hell. I remember being at work and having to call our dad. I remember Leslie's office because I trashed it really bad. I remember the rivers that came streaming down from my face. I remember cursing everything, even the time and the place. I remember waiting to see you carried off of a plane. I kept quiet as they marched you on. No, I wouldn't show my pain. I remember the streets filled with friends and strangers came to see the boy from our little town who won a posthumous VC. I remember a normal man who played football and drank beer. He drank tequila, he drank vodka, Jaeger, he had no fear. I remember that I am getting older, and that you never will. Time's moving on and I'm growing up, and yet you're always still. I remember you'll never be there if I get married, if I have kids. We will never grow old together, and you will never remember this. You'll never meet your nephews or see your niece again. The people you saved had families. It wasn't for me, it was for them. I remember this pain, this loss, it's all embedded deep, scarred into my heart and flesh so bad I still don't sleep. I remember this every day, and I'm never able to forget the sacrifice made by you and countless other vets. But it's those you loved and left behind who loved you just like me, who remember you all day and night, all year round, and that is a guarantee. For some, it's just a time of year to acknowledge our heroes who gave more than you could give. They gave their all for you and I, so we can relax, enjoy, and live. That's all very hard to do because it hurts that you're not here. There's a space missing at our table and it's gathering more dust every year. I remember all my pride that I feel because of you. You give me hope and strength when I don't know what to do. I remember all of this. You'll live on in my words too. Now one last time, let me ask, what does remembrance mean to you?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Patriot Show. I'm your host, Anthony Stephen Malone. Today, I have a very special guest on the show, Nigel Hinkin, veteran of the Parachute Regiment, owner of the Pegasus Bar in Arnhem. He is here to speak about the 5 Victoria Crosses that were awarded during Operation Market Garden, Arnhem, World War II. Hello, Nigel. How are you doing?
Very good. Yourself?
I am good, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. Very special interview because of who you are, a former veteran of the Parachute Regiment, and you are sat in Arnhem right now in your bar, the Pegasus in Arnhem. So what a fitting person and a fitting place to actually speak about this, about the Victorian crosses that were awarded at that time. Can you give my viewers a little bit of background about yourself, please?
Yep, my name's Nigel, formerly of Free Parachute Regiment, and now the owner of the Pegasus in Arnhem.
Hi, mate. You've got a lot of memorabilia on your walls about the Operation Market Garden as well. You've got one particular thing, which is a field telephone. Can you give us a history of that, please?
Yeah, the field telephone, it was up on the shelf behind the bar. That was donated. It's donated on loan. It doesn't actually belong to the bar. It's donated on loan by a local Dutch lad. He does all the memorabilia collection and the reenactment, stuff like that. It is actually the RHQ field phone. It was found in the remains of the building that John Frost used as his HQ during the battle.
Yes, so you've got a lot of history in your establishment. To my viewers out there, both in the United Kingdom and across the world, can you give them an overview of what Operation Market Garden was?
So Market Garden, it was an operation that was devised in the hope of ending the Second World War a lot earlier than people had hoped. The initiative was to drop 65,000 airborne troops roughly 60 miles behind enemy lines. They would secure a series of bridges along the Rhine. The last bridge being secured was here in Arnhem, which would have then given the Allied forces a direct route straight into Germany in order to finish the war. With the airborne troops dropping in, it was then down to 30 Corps to come along what they called Hell's Highway. It was just a single road that led up towards Arnhem itself, using the bridges that crossed the Rhine in order to get to Arnhem.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and as they say, the rest is history. Because obviously, to give my viewers an idea of the scope of this was one of the biggest operations of World War II. So it involved a lot of men from a lot of different countries.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what other countries were involved in Market Garden?
So you had, I mean, obviously you had the Dutch resistance, you had the intelligence that came from the Dutch themselves. You had the American airborne, you had the Polish airborne and the British airborne, all that came under the command of General Eisenhower, and named as the First Allied Airborne Army. Obviously, the Americans jumped, so the 82nd and the 101st, they were given the tasks of the Eindhoven and the Nijmegen bridges, and then the British, so the first British Airborne Division. They were given the task of Arnhem, along with the Dutch soldiers that jumped in with the British, and then later on during the battle, the Polish that came in to bolster the forces.
Yeah. Can you give us an idea of the number of men that were involved in the operation?
There was 35,000 troops in total dropped behind enemy lines. 11,000 of those actually jumped into the surrounding areas, the DZs and the landing zones around Arnhem. Because obviously it wasn't just parachute troops, it was air landing troops as well in gliders. So it was, you know, there was the parachute regiment, South Staffordshire, there was the glider regiment. There was quite a few bodies involved with the whole operation.
Yes. So the actual scope of this was massive. It had never been done before in history.
No,
So
massive. It had never been done before. It was during that time. It was the largest ever airborne operation that had been mounted, and it still is today.
Yeah. So the history of it and what actually happened, it went down to be in legend, for want of a better word. The fighting, a lot of the intelligence, in hindsight, all these years later, looking back, a lot of the intelligence that was given about Arnhem wasn't that accurate at the time. The airborne forces were told there shouldn't be much resistance around the bridge or the areas surrounding the bridge as well. Can you talk us through a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, the British and the Polish, they landed in several areas surrounding the RAF themselves. They were asked if they could use DZs closer to the bridge. The answer to that was no, because of the fear of the flak and the amount of planes that they would lose. So the DZ, you've got X, Y, and Z. They're literally roughly 10 miles from Arnhem themselves, within Driel, Renkum, Gingle Heath. it's quite difficult to pronounce it in Dutch, and Wolfhazer.
Yeah, that what you just said, the 10-mile from the drop zone into actual Arnhem, is one of the things of P Company now. Well, it has been for a very long time. So recruits in the parachute regiment have got the pass 10-mile battle test. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's called a 10-miler as part of P Company, and it replicates basically being dropped on a DZ and then having to TAB, which is a tactical advance to battle, 10 miles, and still be able to fight in the face of the enemy when you get there.
Yeah, being able to fight in the face of the enemy once you get at the end of it. The TAB is just a way to get there, to get to the actual enemy. Then after that, fight as well. Obviously, the 10-miler is included in P Company as well. So a little bit of history there is done by every single person who goes through P Company. The citations and the Victoria Crosses, 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Operation Market Garden. Can you read some of these citations?
Yeah, I've got them on the wall. I've got
recording.
So the first one I'm going to read you out is Lance Sergeant John Baskerville, VC. So he was the South Staffordshire Regiment, and he was an NCO in charge of a artillery gun, anti-tank artillery pieces. So on the 20th of September 1944, during the Battle of Arnhem, Lance Sergeant Baskerville was the NCO in charge of a 6-pounder anti-tank gun at Oosterbeek. The enemy developed a major attack in this sector. with infantry tanks and self-propelled guns, with the obvious intention to break into and overrun the battalion's position. During the early stage of the action, the crew commanded by this NCO was responsible for the destruction of 2 Tiger tanks and at least 1 self-propelled gun. Thanks to the coolness and daring of this NCO, who, with complete disregard for his own safety, each tank to come well within 100 yards before opening fire. In the case of this preliminary engagement, Lance Sergeant Baskerville was badly wounded in the leg, and the remainder of his crew were either killed or badly wounded. During a brief respite after the engagement, Lance Sergeant Baskerville refused to be carried to the regimental aid post and spent his time attending his gun and shouting encouragement to his comrades in neighbouring trenches. After a short interval, the enemy renewed the attack with even greater ferocity than before. Under cover of intense mortar and shell fire, manning his gun quite alone, Lance Sergeant Baskerville continued to fire round after round at the enemy until his gun was put out of action. By this time, his activity was the main factor in keeping the enemy tanks at bay. The fact that the surviving men in his vicinity were held together and kept in action was undoubtedly due to his magnificent example and outstanding courage. Time after time, the enemy attacks were launched and driven off. Finally, when his gun was knocked out, Lance Sergeant Baskerville crawled under intense enemy fire to another 6-pounder gun nearby, the crew of which had been killed, and proceeded to man this gun single-handed. With the gun, he engaged an enemy self-propelled gun, which was approaching to attack. Another soldier crawled over open ground to assist him, but was killed almost at once. Lance Sergeant Baskerville succeeded in firing 2 rounds of the SP gun, scoring direct hits, which rendered it ineffective. Whilst preparing to fire a 3rd round, however, he was killed by a shell from a supporting enemy tank. The superb gallantry of this NCO is beyond praise. During the remaining days at Arnhem, stories of his valour were a constant inspiration to all ranks. He spurned danger, ignored pain, and by his supreme fighting spirit, infected all who witnessed his conduct with the same aggressiveness and dogged devotion to duty, which characterised his actions throughout. And there we have
the man himself.
The man himself alongside his VC. And a image of a 6-pounder gun similar to the one that he was using at the time. We then go along to Lieutenant John Pellington Greyburn, VC, of the 2nd Battalion and Parachute Regiment. Lieutenant Greyburn was a platoon commander of the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment. Was dropped on the 17th of September 1904 with the task of seizing and holding the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. The north end of the bridge was captured, and early in the night, Lieutenant Greyburn was ordered to assault and capture the southern end with his platoon. He led his platoon onto the bridge and began the attack with the utmost determination. But the platoon was met with a hail of fire from a 20mm quick-firing guns and from the machine guns of the armoured car. Almost at once, Lieutenant Greyburn was shot through the shoulder, although there was no cover on the bridge, and in spite of his wounds, Lieutenant Greyburn continued to press forward with the greatest dash and bravery until casualties became so heavy that he was ordered to withdraw. He directed the withdrawal from the bridge personally and was himself the last man to come off the embankment into the comparative cover. Later, his platoon was to occupy a house, which was vital to the defence of the bridge, and he personally organised the occupation of the house. Throughout the next day and night, the enemy made ceaseless attacks on the house, using not only infantry with mortars and machine guns, but also tanks and self-propelled guns. The house was very exposed and difficult to defend, and the fact that it did not fall into enemy hands must be attributed to Lieutenant Greyburn's great courage and inspiring leadership. He constantly exposed himself to the enemy's fire whilst moving along and encouraging his platoon, and seemed completely oblivious to the danger. On the 19th of September 1944, the enemy renewed their attack, which increased in intensity. As the house was vital to the defence of the bridge, all attacks were repulsed due to Lieutenant Greyburn's valour and skill in organising and encouraging his men, until eventually the house was set on fire and had to be evacuated. On the 20th of September 1944, he extended his defence by a series of fighting patrols, which prevented the enemy getting access to the houses in the vicinity, the occupation of which would have prejudiced the defence of the bridge. Was forced to withdraw to an area further north. The enemy now attempted to lay demolition charges under the bridge, and the situation was now critical. Realising this, Lieutenant Greyburn organised and led a fighting patrol which drove the enemy off temporarily and gave time for the fuses to be removed. He was again wounded, this time in the back, but refused to be evacuated. Finally, an enemy tank against which Lieutenant Greyburn had no defence approached so close to his position that it became untenable. He then stood up in full view of the tank and personally directed the withdrawal of his men to the main defensive perimeter to which he had been ordered. He was killed that night. From the evening of 17th of September until the night of the 20th of September 1944, a period of over 3 days, Lieutenant Greyburn led his men with supreme gallantry and determination. Although in pain and weakened by his wounds, short of food and without sleep, his courage never flagged. There is no doubt that it had not been for his officers' inspiring leadership and personal bravery, the Arnhem Bridge could never have been held for this amount of time. And that is Lieutenant Greyburn.
The man himself again.
Now going to move on to Captain, I don't know if you can see that one, to Captain Lionel Ernest Quirrell, VC. In Holland, Arnhem on the 19th September 1944, Captain Lionel Quirrell was acting as a company commander of a composite company composed of 3 parachute battalions. At 1400 hours on that day, his company was advancing along the main road, which ran on an embankment towards Arnhem. The advance was conducted under continuous medium machine gun fire, which at one period became so heavy that the company became split up on either side of the road and suffered considerable losses. Captain Quirrell at once proceeded to reorganize his forces, crossing and recrossing the road while doing so, under extremely heavy and accurate fire. During this period, he carried a wounded sergeant to the regimental aid post under fire and was himself wounded in the face. Having reorganized his forces, Captain Quirrell personally led a party of men against a strong point holding up the advance. This strong point consisted of a captured British anti-tank gun and 2 machine guns. Despite the extremely heavy fire directed at him, Captain Quirrell succeeded in killing the crews of the machine guns and recapturing the anti-tank gun. As a result of this, the advance was able to continue. Later in the same day, Captain Quirrell found himself cut off with a small party of men and took up a position in a ditch. By this time, he had received further wounds in both arms. Regardless of his wounds and the very heavy mortar and Spadau fire, he continued to inspire his men to resist with hand grenades, pistols, and the few remaining rifles. As however, the enemy pressure increased, Captain Quirrell decided that it was impossible to hold the position longer and ordered his men to withdraw. Despite their protests, he insisted in remaining behind to cover their withdrawal. With his automatic pistol and a few remaining hand grenades, this is the last occasion on which he was seen. During the whole of the period of 9 hours of confused and bitter fighting, Captain Quirrell displayed the highest standard of gallantry under most difficult and trying circumstances. His courage, leadership, and devotion to duty were magnificent and an inspiration to all. This officer is officially reported to be wounded and missing. We've then got Flight Lieutenant David Samuel Anthony Lord, VC and DFC. DFC, the Distinguished Flying Cross. On Tuesday the 19th, while on final approach to the drop zones and only 3 minutes away from them, heavy anti-aircraft fire tore away with slowly moving aircraft. Lord's plane received 2 hits on the starboard wing and the engine. On that side, it burst into flames. At such a low height, there was no way to extinguish such a fire, and so the only real option in such a situation would be to abandon the attempt to drop supplies and bail out before the fuel tanks exploded. However, Lord refused to do so and kept flying true and steady to make sure he dropped his supplies on target. With his aircraft clearly in dire trouble, Lord was signalled out for attention by most every German anti-aircraft gun in the vicinity. He continued on his path and reached the drop zone. After completing his run, Lord was informed by his calm and highly disciplined crew, 3 RAF personnel and 4 Army dispatchers, that 2 canisters of supplies still remained. Lord turned the aircraft around for a second pass over the drop-in zone, still under intense fire. When all the supplies were at last dropped and the aircraft had descended to a perilously low level of 500 feet, Lord cried to his men, "Bail out, bail out. For God's sake, bail out." While making absolutely no effort to do so himself, a few seconds later, the starboard wing exploded and the plane crashed into flames into the ground just north of the Riders' camp from LZS. There was only one survivor, Flying Officer Harry King, who was blown out of the side door when the engine exploded. King himself landed in no man's land between the British and the Germans, but he managed to find the 10th Battalion and stayed with them until eventually captured. The sight of Lord's crippled aircraft was witnessed by troops on the ground, who were so mesmerised by this single plane that they stood up in their trenches to will it on. They were all highly moved, in some cases to tears, by the tremendous display of courage and self-sacrifice on their behalfs. With flames licking wildly under the fuselage, many men were pleading for the crew to jump, but they did not, and instead the dispatchers were seen to be continuously throwing out more supply containers until the wing collapsed. From the point that the engine caught fire to the moment of the crash, Flight Lieutenant Lord flew his Dakota steadily while under heavy anti-aircraft fire for a total of 8 minutes. For his suicidal bravery and single-minded determination to get the supplies to those who needed it, David Lord was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. The great tragedy of his story was that supply dropping zones had been overrun by German troops due to the radio blackout. The RAF knew nothing of this, and so David Lord and his men gave their lives desperately trying to drop cargo that would end up in the hands of the enemy. And there is a picture of Flight Lieutenant David Lord's Dakota there. And since that, there is a flight which continues, and it is actually painted and decorated in the colours and numbers of Flight Lieutenant Lord's Dakota that crashed that day. So that's the 4 VCs that were awarded posthumously. There was a 5th VC awarded in Arnhem, and it was to Acting Major Robert Henry Keynes, VC. Was the only recipient of the VC during Arnhem that was actually awarded to him by King George. In Holland on the 19th of September 1944, Major Kane was commanding a rifle company of the South Staffordshire Regiment during the Battle of Arnhem, when his company was cut off from the rest of the battalion, and during the next 6 days was closely engaged with enemy tanks, self-propelled guns and infantry. The Germans made repeated attempts to break into the company position by infiltrating, and had they succeeded in doing so, the whole situation of the airborne troops would have been jeopardized. Major Kane, by his outstanding devotion to duty and remarkable powers of leadership, was to a large extent personally responsible for saving a vital sector from falling into the hands of the enemy. On the 20th of September, a Tiger tank approached the area held by his company. Major Keynes went out alone to deal with it, armed with a Piat. Taking up position, he held his fire until the tank was nearly 20 yards from when he opened up. The tank immediately halted and turned its gun on him, shooting away a corner of the house near where the officer was laying. Although wounded by machine gun bullets and falling masonry, Captain Kane continued firing until he had scored several direct hits, immobilized the tank, and supervised the bringing up of the 75mm howitzer, which completely destroyed it. Only then would he consent to have his wounds dressed. In the next morning, this officer drove off 3 more tanks by the fearless use of his Piat. On each occasion, leaving cover and taking up position in the open ground with complete disregard for his own personal safety. During the following days, Major Cam was everywhere where danger threatened, moving amongst his men and encouraging them by his fearless example to hold out. He refused rest and medical attention in spite of the fact that his hearing had been seriously impaired because of the perforated eardrums, and he was suffering from multiple wounds. On the 25th of September, the enemy made a concentrated attack on Major Kane's position, using self-propelled guns, flamethrowers, and infantry. By this time, the last Piat had been put out of action, and Major Kane was armed with only a light 2-inch mortar. However, by a skillful use of this weapon and his daring leadership of a few men still under his command, he completely demoralized the enemy, who after an engagement lasting more than 3 hours, withdrew in disorder. Throughout the whole course of the Battle of Arnhem, Major Kane showed superb gallantry, his powers of endurance and leadership were the admiration of all his fellow officers, and stories of his valor were being constantly exchanged among the troops. His coolness and courage under incessant fire could not be surpassed. That is the story of the 5 VCs that were won during the Battle of Arnhem and Operation Market Garden.
Well, Nigel, can you tell us a little bit about this picture and the history of it, please?
Right, this picture itself depicts the last stand of the 10th, being the 10th Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. It's based in and around so that the last perimeter defences of Oosterbeek before everybody was withdrawn across the Rhine. There's another picture to the side here, and it's the last stand of the 10th as described by Victor Gregg, who was actually part of the last stand of the 10th. And it's a little story that he tells. And then, so the last stand of the 10th, the Oosterbeek perimeter, Battle of Arnhem, September 1944. So that is on the wall. Would you like me to read that out?
If you can, please, yes.
Right. So a note about the painting. The last stand of the 10th. There are always people who give rise to doubt concerning the authenticity of paintings and descriptions by authors and writers who try to describe a scene from second and third hand sources. I can assure any of the doubters that the scene the artist has created with this brush is about as true and factual as could ever be expected. I was anything from 500 to 1,000 yards from the remnants of the battalion. My vicars was stationed in the front garden of a half-demolished house. This particular hour of the battle was taking place as whoever was in command had realised by the 3rd day that this action had turned into a last round, last man situation. The almost eyeball-to-eyeball fighting that was going on was as brutal as the artist has successfully achieved. It was quite possible that the women and children in any of these houses would have been sheltering in the cellars as they were in the house with me. My vicars and about a dozen other lads, that's how it turned in the end. Those were still standing, were open, were roped in together. I never had a clue who the two were part of my gun crew came from. But for all that, I never experienced a discord among men who were taking orders from anyone who had a stripe or a pip. Yes, you could rightly say that the affair at Arnhem was a one-off, a big balls up. It may have well been, but it exhibited to the world the never say die spirit of the average British Tommy. Victor Gregg, March 2019. On his 18th birthday in 1937, Vic enlisted in the Rifle Brigade. He saw action across North Africa, was a driver for the Land Range Desert Group, and fought with the Rifles at El Alamein. He joined the 10th Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, in 1943 as a Vickers machine gunner in support company. He fought with the battalion during the invasion of Italy and Arnhem, where he was taken prisoner as a POW. He was sentenced to death for sabotaging a Dresden factory and saved only by the Allied bombing of that city, which blew apart his prison. His post-war life was equally fascinating, and extraordinarily, in 2019, at the age of 99, he was one of the very few last men standing of the battalion. Read his full story in Rifleman, which is published by Bloomsbury Press, 2011. And this, so you've got the picture, his authentication of the picture, and then you've got the actual. So the last stand of the 10th, the Ulster Perimeter, Battle of Arnhem, September 1944. A signed limited print edition of 75 from the original painting by Derek Chambers, FRSA, kindly donated to Friends of the 10th charity by the artist to commemorate the 75th anniversary in final actions of the decimated 10th Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, at the Battle of Arnhem from the 18th to the 26th September 1944. As part of Operation Market Garden, the 10th Battalion were dropped into Arnhem as part of the second lift on the 18th September 1944, with the objective of securing the northern approaches of the famous bridge at Arnhem, the final crossing point of the operation. 582 paratroopers of the battalion left the UK and landed in Holland. After the battle on the 25th, 26th September, only 36 men returned to their base in Somerby, Leicestershire. On the 30th of September, followed a few days later by a further 50 survivors. On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 20th September, having already lost over 450 of his men, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, commanding officer Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Smythe, who was himself already wounded, together with the remnants of his battalion, was tasked to defend the eastern side of the divisional defence perimeter at Oosterbeek. By now, the battalion was reduced to just a handful of officers and 58 NCOs and other ranks. As a cohesive fighting unit, another 40 10th Battalion men were dispersed, fighting with other units. This painting depicts a scene from the house defended by the main corps of the remaining battalion astride the road junction formed by Utrechtweg and Allenstraat. An isolated and very exposed position, later located some 200 meters ahead of the main 1st Airborne Divisional perimeter, with only small arms, mines, piers and mortars with which to defend the junction, and in the face of overwhelming enemy opposition and armour, the battalion successfully defended this position for a further 3 days, fighting from house to house as the buildings were systematically destroyed and their numbers reduced. on the 23rd of September, with all their officers now either dead or wounded, and the remaining 30-odd men holding this position were relieved and withdrawn into the perimeter, joining other mixed airborne units fighting nearby. The fighting qualities and determined resistance of the men of the 10th was perfectly described. I can't pronounce that gentleman's name. Hans Müller, the commanding officer of the opposing SS forces, commenting that they had fought like cornered tigers, even more determined than we had experienced against the Russians on the Eastern Front. As a result of their losses incurred at Arnhem, the 10th Battalion was never reformed during World War II, and the small number of survivors were absorbed into the 2nd Battalion, who had incurred equally severe losses during Operation Market Garden.
Well, everybody, that was some very emotional stories, citations about the Victorian Crosses and the battles around Arnhem. On a personal level, on that, my granddad also fought in the Battle of Alamein, World War II, and he also went over and fought throughout Italy as well. So for me personally, it was it was interesting to hear all those citations and what had actually happened to the 10th and to the men that were there, as well as. Hi Nigel, thank you so much for reading all of that. I know that was not easy, but I wanted my viewers to get a good understanding and background of what everyone knows VCs were issued, but they don't know why. Now they've heard the citations, not stories, the citations of why the guys were issued them. Since Operation Market Garden, World War II, 9 other Victoria Crosses have been awarded to members of the Parachute Regiment. Nigel, can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so the Parachute Regiment Airborne Forces, there's 9 in total. There's the 5 that we've just covered. There was 2 more awarded in the Falklands. Famously, you've got Colonel H. Jones. He was the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. And again, in the Falklands, you've got Sergeant Ian Mackay. He was the platoon sergeant of the 6th Platoon B Company 3 Para in the Falklands. You've later got then Corporal Brian Budd, again of the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, in the face of the Taliban. His section was pinned down. He stood up alone on himself, fought through the field, and was later discovered surrounded by several Taliban fighters and himself. And then the latest one is Lance Corporal Josh Leakey. His was awarded, he was a junior NCO as part of a firefight. They were pinned down by heavy fire, and I don't have the exact citations for this, but I know Josh personally. He doesn't like talking about it. He's very modest to the fact. But his involved the rescue of American officers and the repositioning of machine guns to win the firefight back in their favour.
Yeah, there is incredible stories of heroism. I am very proud, as you are. We both passed P Company together, and we both served in 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment as well. And we are extremely proud and honoured to be able to do this interview about the stories of heroism from members of the airborne forces. We're going to end the interview with something which is very important and very deep rooted to members of the Airborne Forces and Parachute Regiment. It is a poem by Field Marshal Vincent Montgomery of Arnhem. Nigel, would you like to read the poem out, please?
Yeah, so Field Marshal Bernard Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He said, "What manner of men are these who wear the maroon beret? They are firstly all volunteers and are then toughened by physical training. As a result, they have the infectious optimism and the offensive eagerness which comes from well-being. They have jumped from the air and by doing so have conquered fear. Their duty lies in the van of battle. They are proud of this honour. They have the highest standards in all things, whether it be skill in battle or smartness in the execution of all peacetime duties. They are, in fact, men apart, every man an emperor."
Thank you, Nigel, for reading that out. Every man an emperor. Every member of the regiment is that. End of. The heroism. They're only a very small part of some of these stories and bravery showed by members of the armed forces in World War II up to present day as well. There is a lot more incredible stories that we're privy to that are not public at the moment. Hopefully, in time, history will be written, and the stories of Afghanistan and Iraq will also be recorded in that publicly. I would like to give a big shout out to all our airborne brothers and sisters all over the world. And all my very close friends in 101st Airborne Division and 82nd Airborne Division. Hope to see all you guys very soon. Right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope you've enjoyed the interview and the information included in it. Nigel, would you like to say anything else?
No, thank you for having me on. Thank you for inviting me to talk and highlight the bravery of the men that fought here in Arnhem with the VCs that were won. There's one story that rings in my mind every time I come here. A good few years ago, when I visited Arnhem, I got talking to a veteran, Vince, who sadly passed away now. And he used to tell us of the story, or he told us of the story that the night before they were due to jump into Arnhem, they were in the local bar, and you had the farmers that were saying, you know, sew coins into your webbing straps. Go sew coins in your webbing straps, and they just sort of dismissed it at the time. And then later on that evening, when Vince was back at barracks, he actually took the old 2p coins. You know, they were quite big coins, and he actually sewed them into the webbing, you know, his webbing straps. Not long after hitting the DZ, Vince was actually hit in the webbing strap, and the round hit one of the coins that he'd sewn into his webbing strap, therefore saving his life. And I never forget what he says. He went, "God, boy," he said, "it hurt like hell." He said, "It put me on my arse." And from that day on, the round had literally turned that 2p coin into like a thimble. And he carried that everywhere he went for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
I mean, the Arnhem veterans are very few and far between now. But it's stories like that, you know, from when they were over here, that you just sit there with with your mouth wide open and listening to what they were, what they went through and what they're saying.
Well, it inspired us. It inspires future generations and members of the Airborne Brotherhood. The Airborne Brotherhood is worldwide, and it's a very strong group of individuals. Doesn't matter what country you come from, you've always got that in common. If you can strap a parachute to your back and jump out of an aeroplane, it's different. But Nigel, on a personal level, thank you so much for coming onto the Patriot Show and talking about the Victoria Crosses and Operation Market Garden. As soon as the COVID restrictions have been lifted, I would recommend anybody go over to Arnhem, visit the Pegasus. The memorabilia is incredible in there, and you can learn so much about what happened at Market Garden as well. Okay, Nigel, thanks again for everything. You're looking very smart there in your 3-power tie. Outstanding. Okay, everybody, thank you for watching the Patriot Show. It's been emotional. Hope it's been informative. Catch you on the next show. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.